So our first item tonight is a proclamation. It's Women's Suffrage Centennial Proclamation, and it will be presented by Milwaukee Historical Society's Linda Carr and Haley McCoy. Are they on? There's Haley.
Hello.
There's Linda. Okay, good. Hi. Welcome.
Hey. Scott, how do I share my screen?
So I've made you a co-host.
Okay.
And so at the bottom of your screen, there should be a green button that says share screen. And
Gotcha.
I'll give you an option of
Share. There we go. Okay. Okay. Why isn't it? There we go. Okay. All right, Linda?
Hello. Yes, I'm speaking for the museum to begin. In 2020, like all of us, this has been a challenging year, and the Milwaukee Museum is no different. Our last public event was March 4th, and as you may remember, it was a great presentation on Black history at Ledding Library. Thank you, Council President Faulkner, for being one of our guest speakers. Since that time, Milwaukee Museum has been closed to the public. We canceled our 2020 Historic Lake Road Historic Home Tour and our annual picnic. We are still unsure if we will host our annual Christmas at the museum, where over 300 people come to enjoy sitting on Santa's lap. Uncomfortable. We miss being out in the community with events like Ardenwald concerts, First Fridays, Sunday Farmers Market, and working with the wonderful city recorders staff for other opportunities. With all that said, we have not been bored. We have been diligently working on recording and digitizing our collections, improving our landscaping, revising our bylaws, making plans for future events. We are really excited about Ardenwald's adventures, a new virtual walking tour just like Lott's Loop coming soon to our website. The walk stretches from the Public Safety Building to Safeway to Water Tower Park to Davis Graveyard and to 32nd/Johnson Creek. The walk is about 5.5 miles and talks about the parks, people, places, and planning. This has been a collaborative effort including Council President Faulkner, the City of Milwaukee, Milwaukee Parks Foundation, Friends of Tideman Johnson, Jim the Barber, Ardenwald NDA, Llewellyn NDA, Hector Campbell NDA, PDX Design, and Chapel Theater. A special thank you to Kim Travis, David Parker, the Denhams, and the Hemers for doing the grunt work on this project. Look for it in September on our website. Remember, even though we are not open Saturdays 1 to 5 just yet, if you have a question or a special request, just email us and we'll try to find some answers. Now we're going to talk about women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement began in the 1840s, in the earliest days of westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, and the Oregon Trail. Women had become tired of the traditional family roles. The husband is the breadwinner, the wife is a subservient child rearer and housekeeper. They began focusing on social reform by joining social groups. These groups included temperance leagues, anti-slavery movements, and moral reform organizations. They were among the earliest activists for workday regulation, child labor reform, domestic violence laws, and homelessness. Local leaders, who we will further discuss, helped pave the way to women's voting rights in Oregon and across the country. Haley, you want to move to the next slide? An incredibly brief history of the suffragist movement in America. In 1848, a group of
Linda, before you keep going, I'm sorry, Haley, the slide didn't move.
Yeah, it did not.
Looking at the main page. It's possible maybe you're sharing a different screen and you've left this one. Did it open a new window when you launched the presentation?
That's very possible. Okay, hold on. Let me.
Sorry, Linda. I wanted to make sure we saw that you guys prepared.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
There we go.
I don't know when I hit when I hit start slide, it pops up with a new window. It's so it's not going to be fancy and take up the whole screen. But so here we go.
Okay.
Sorry,
it looks
guys.
Good here. It looks good.
Thanks, Linda.
No problem. An incredibly brief history of the suffragist movement in America. In 1848, a group of abolitionist activists gathered for the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. In a group primarily made of women, they gathered to discuss the issues of women's rights. The unanimous message was simple. American women as individuals demanded their own political identities. While the next slide, Haley. While the Civil War in the 1860s temporarily slowed their movement, the passing of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which allowed African American men the right to vote, further fueled women activists' push for the legalization of women voters. Some women's suffragist group even went so far as to side with the racist Southerners who argued that white women's votes could be used to neutralize those cast by African Americans. In 1869, the National Women's Suffrage Association was founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which fought for a constitutional amendment for all people. Abolitionist suffragists who argued that it was unfair to threaten the African American enfranchisement by uniting with a less popular women's suffrage movement, created the American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1890, the groups merged to create the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA. By now, their approach had changed. Instead of arguing that women were created equal to men and thus deserved the same rights, their new stance was that they deserved to vote because they were different from men. They began promoting a pure, more moral, and maternal political role based on their domesticity. The 1890s saw a slow turn for women's rights. Wyoming was the first state to grant women the right to vote in 1890. Then came Colorado in 1893, Utah and Idaho in 1896, Washington in 1910, California in 1911, finally Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona in 1912. As some westward states began allowing women the right to vote, eastern and southern states remained vehemently opposed. Carrie Chapman Catt, Nassau president, proposed a blitz campaign through the mobilization of local, state, and national suffrage groups, specifically focusing on the eastern and southern states. Other groups began to take more drastic approaches. A splinter group led by Alice Paul began focusing on more radical tactics for attention. Picketing the White House and public hunger strikes brought dramatic publicity to their cause. World War I may have temporarily slowed the women's suffrage movement, but regained traction due to women's work during the war effort, proving that women were just as deserving of citizenship as men. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. That year, on November 2nd, more than 8 million women voted in local, state, and national elections for the first time. Let's vote, ladies.
That's right. Okay. So now we're going to talk about some notable women in the Oregon suffrage movement. So here we see Abigail Scott Duniway. She is arguably the most recognizable name in the Oregon suffrage movement. She was born Abigail Jane Scott on October 22nd, 1834, to John Tucker Scott and Anne Rolifson Scott outside of Groveland, Illinois. In March of 1852, at the age of 17, she crossed the Oregon Trail. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I have a 3-year-old. It's the quietest place in my house. I'm sorry. Or what was I?
Apologies necessary.
In March of 1852, at the age of 17, she crossed the Oregon Trail with her family, settling in Lafayette. In 1853, she married farmer Benjamin Charles Duniway. They first lived and farmed in Clackamas County, actually, and they lived in Milwaukee at one point, before moving back to Lafayette. Abigail went to Albany to become a school teacher before opening a millinery and notions shop. In 1871, impassioned by the strife and injustices told to her by the married patrons of her shop, she moved to Portland and created the New Northwest, a women's right and suffrage newspaper. That same year, she arranged for suffragist Susan B. Anthony to tour the Pacific Northwest, and she toured again in 1896. That tour led to the creation of the Oregon Women's Suffrage Association in 1873. In 1872, she was to be the lone speaker on behalf of the Oregon State Women's Suffrage Association to address the Oregon legislature in regards to the women's suffrage movement. In fear of what their husbands and others in their communities might say, no other women of the organization were willing to join her except Dr. Mary Sawtell. In 1872, Dunaway and fellow suffragists, Mrs. Beatty, Mrs. M.A. Lambert, and Miss Maria Hendy, were arrested for attempting to vote. On November 5th, 1912, 52% of male voters of the state approved extending the right to vote to women. Oregon Governor Oswald West asked Dunaway to write and sign the state's equal suffrage proclamation. Additionally, she was the first female registered voter in Multnomah County. Here we have Hattie Redmond. Harriet Hattie Redmond was born around 1862 in St. Louis, Missouri, to emancipated slaves Lavinia Blue and Reuben Crawford. The family moved to Marysville, California in 1871, then to Hood River, Oregon, before settling in Portland in 1880. She attended Portland's Colored School. Her family was active in Portland's African American community. They were members of Mount Olivet Baptist Church, the first Black Baptist church in Portland. In 1893, she married Emerson Redmond, a hotel waiter. Their marriage was an unhappy one, and they didn't have any children. Because of the color of Hattie's skin, she was afforded very few job opportunities. She worked as a hairdresser, a department store duster, and a janitor for the U.S. District Court of Oregon, from which she received a pension in 1929 after 29 years of employment. Like her parents, Hattie was a civil rights activist, fighting for the rights of African Americans and women. She was a dedicated leader of the Colored Women's Equal Suffrage Association, an organization born out of the barring of women of color from both local and national suffrage groups. She organized meetings, lectures, and educational conferences on women's suffrage at Mount Olivet. She also served on the Central Campaign Committee, which united different suffrage factions across Oregon. With white women earning the right to vote in Oregon in 1912 and nationally in 1920, Hattie and African American suffrage groups continued fighting for African American rights. Her hard work and dedication laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that ultimately led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Unfortunately, Hattie passed away in 1952, 13 years before the passing of the Voting Rights Act. 60 years after her death, historians who were researching Oregon's women's suffrage movement for the centennial celebration discovered records documenting Hattie's hard work and dedication to the suffrage and African American equality movements. Before that, her work went virtually unknown. After its discovery, her simple grave marker in Lone Fir Pioneer Cemetery was replaced with a proper tombstone, honoring her with the inscription, Black American Suffragist. Eva Emery Dye was a prominent member of Clackamas County's women's suffrage movement. She was born in Prophetstown, Illinois in 1855. At the age of 15, she began her writing career under the pseudonym Jenny Juniper, publishing works in local and regional newspapers. Fueled by her ambition to learn and against the wishes of her father, she worked as a school teacher and saved money to attend Oberlin College. Upon her graduation in 1882, she was named Poet Laureate of her class. She married fellow Oberlin alum Charles Henry Dye. Her work lay dormant until 1890 when the Dyes moved from Illinois to Oregon City. They rose to prominence and wealth in Oregon City society with Charles's law and real estate investing careers. Eva fell in love with the historical qualities of Oregon City and Clackamas County, saying, "I began writing as soon as I reached this old and romantic historical city. I saw beautiful historical material laying around like nuggets." In 1900, she released the book entitled McLaughlin and Old Oregon, a historical biography, albeit a more fictitious historical biography on John McLaughlin. The book's success cemented Eva as a local celebrity author. After the success of her first book, she began researching the Lewis and Clark expedition After the success of her first book, she began researching the Lewis and Clark expedition. In her second book, titled The Conquest, about William Clark and his brother George Rogers Clark, she focused greatly on Sacagawea, the Lemhi Shoshone woman who at 16, and already a mother, helped Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on the expedition to the Pacific Northwest. Di noted in her book that Sacagawea had been given the vote in the building of Fort Clatsop, and whether or not the group was to spend the winter on the Pacific coast. Because of Di's book, Sacagawea was described as being the Madonna on a fur race and was seen as a symbol of the women's suffrage movement, which Di was in support of. In 1905, she was pivotal in the decision to erect the Sacagawea and John Baptiste statue in Washington Park in Portland, saying, "This is the first time in history that a statue has been erected in memory of a woman who accomplished patriotic deeds. This recognition of the assistance rendered by a woman in the discovery of this great section of the country is but the beginning of what is due." Okay. So, on May 22nd, 1902, women of Clackamas County sent an impassioned letter to their male counterparts, urging for their support in achieving women's voting rights. It said, "Dear husbands, brothers, and sons, we, your wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters, after having crossed the plains with you, built a new land of freedom, after braving the perils of starvation, Indian wars, and frontier hardships, after tending to your hearth fires for 2 generations and giving the best of our lives for the conquest of wilderness, today ask for your ballot. We have owned lands alone with you from the beginning, have attended the same schools, and in no respect differ from you in intelligence in the interest of our country." Many notable Clackamas County and Milwaukee women signed their names, hoping their influence in local society would help sway popular opinion. Some of these women include Sophronia Llewellyn, the wife of Seth Llewellyn, a pioneer horticulturist, businessman, and politician who was key in Oregon's initiative and referendum system. Mary Beth, and I know I'm not gonna pronounce this right. Uren, wife of William Uren, who wrote measures to direct control of state governments to voters. Eva Emery Dye, who we just discussed. Hannah A. Anderson, she was the wife of H.S. Anderson, judge responsible for the first roads in Clackamas County. And Jenny Harding, the wife of George Harding, she was the granddaughter of Sam Barlow. Oh. The pioneers of the Oregon suffrage movement were among themselves the first Oregon pioneers. They came west in search of new lives, lands, and adventures. These women, whether living in Milwaukee or Clackamas County, Greater Oregon, or nationally, worked tirelessly for women's equality and voting rights. They were more than just wives, daughters, and sisters. They were Americans who worked tirelessly for decades to prove that their worth was more than just domesticity. Their voices and ideas mattered. The issue for women's voting rights appeared on Oregon ballots 6 times. 1884, 1900, 1906, 1908, 1910, and finally 1912. It took 6 tries before it finally passed in 1912, more than any other state in the country. Today, we celebrate the 100-year anniversary of a woman's right to vote. Since 1920, women's rights have come a long way. We still have work to do, but we wouldn't be where we were today without the blood, sweat, and tears of our sisters and brothers of yesterday. We owe it to ourselves, our future generations, and our communities to continue to fight for equality and justice for all people of the United States of America.
Thank you, Haley.
No problem. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Haley and Linda, both for your presentation.
That was great.
I want to know who Ms. Dye's milliner was because that hat was fantastic.
Right? It may have been Abigail Dunaway. I don't know.
I don't know. As a former member of the Abigail Scott Dunaway Women's Center of Linfield College, I appreciate that you highlighted her.
Well, she was an important woman in Oregon and United States history, and so it was an honor to research her, to speak of her, and then present that information to you all.
All right, well, I'll read the proclamation. Whereas Oregon will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States on August 18th, 2020. And whereas the Milwaukee Oak Grove Equal Suffrage League played a significant role in achieving full voting rights for women in Oregon at the 1912 general election. And whereas American women of every race, class, and ethnic background have made historic contributions to the growth and strength of the city of Milwaukee, the state of Oregon, and our nation in countless recorded and unrecorded ways. And whereas American women have played and continue to play a critical economic, cultural, and social role in the life of Milwaukee, Oregon, and our nation by constituting a significant portion of the labor force working inside and outside of the home. And whereas American women have played a unique role throughout the history of Milwaukee, Oregon, and our nation by providing most of the volunteer labor force. And whereas American women of every race, class, and ethnic background served as early leaders in the forefront of every social change movement, including the abolitionist movement, the emancipation movement, the industrial movement, the civil rights movement, and the peace movement, all of which created a more just society for all. Now, therefore, I, Mark Gamba, the mayor of the city of Milwaukee, a municipal corporation in the county of Clackamas in the state of Oregon, do hereby proclaim August 18, 2020 as Women's Suffrage Centennial Day in Milwaukee and encourage all community members to observe this important anniversary.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.